There is a place in coastal Georgia where the air feels heavy, even on bright summer days. A place where the moss-draped trees lean close together, their branches twisting like the arms of silent witnesses. Locals will tell you that Dunbar Creek is not just another stream feeding into the salt marshes. They will say it breathes, that it listens, that it remembers Dot's step onto the banks of the creek, and you may feel it yourself, that strange weight pressing down on your chest, the uneasy stillness of the water, dark and sluggish, as though holding secrets beneath its surface. Fishermen avoid it at night, claiming they hear sounds in the distance, voices that don't belong to the living. Some say they've seen figures moving across the marsh when the tide is low, silhouettes walking where no human should be able to walk. This is the land of St. Simon's Island, a place that has known both beauty and unspeakable tragedy. On postcards, it looks serene, a paradise of swaying grasses, quiet waters, and sun that burns gold on the horizon. But beneath that calm lies one of the most haunting stories in American history. A story not just of death, but of defiance. A story of people who chose to walk away from bondage, into water, and into legend. It is called Igbo Landing. Some say it is simply a footnote in the bloody chronicles of slavery. Others insist it is more than history. It is haunting. A wound that never closed. A moment so powerful that the land itself has been marked forever. To understand why Dunbar Creek carries this reputation, one must go back over 2 centuries, to the year 1803. It was then that a group of men, women, and children from the Igbo people of what is now Nigeria were brought across the Atlantic. They had endured capture, violence, and the infamous Middle Passage, a journey of filth, hunger, and despair. But even in the belly of the slave ships, they held on to a belief older than their captors' whips, that life without freedom was not life at all, freedom or death. That was the Igbo way. And when they reached the shores of Georgia, when they were forced onto small boats to be ferried to plantations, they remembered this creed. What happened next would shake the ground beneath St. Simon's Island forever. But before we step into their final act of resistance, pause here with me, at the edge of the water. Listen closely. The marsh is alive with the sounds of insects and birds, but every now and then there is something else, a low murmur, almost like chanting. The old people in Georgia say that if you are quiet enough, you can still hear the Igbo voices carried on the tide. This is not a simple ghost story. It is not just about spirits lost in the water. No, this is about the weight of memory, the kind that binds generations. The enslaved Africans who came after told their children about Igbo Landing. They passed it down not as tragedy, but as a reminder that even when stripped of everything, one still holds the power to refuse chains. One still holds the power to walk into eternity on their own terms. Yet the creek does not forget the sorrow either. Imagine it, a long line of captives walking slowly into the water, their voices rising together in song, the splash of footsteps swallowed by the dark tide. Imagine their captors standing frozen on the shore, unable to stop them, unable to understand. For the Igbo were not simply dying, they were crossing, they were choosing, they were leaving behind a world of whips and chains for something far greater. And the land remembers. For over 200 years, people have claimed Dunbar Creek is haunted, not in the way of rattling chains or shadowy figures leaping out of trees, but in the deeper sense. The air itself is heavy, as though filled with sorrow. The waters look darker than other streams, as though they drink the grief of the past. Visitors report strange chills, sudden silences where all birds fall. Quiet. Some have sworn they saw figures standing on the water's surface walking. Just as the legend says, back toward Africa. This is the heart of the flying African's tale. A belief that those Igbo did not drown at all. Instead, Through the power of spirit and determination, they rose above the physical world. Some say their bodies sank, but their souls traveled across the ocean, back home. Others insist they transformed, walking upon the waves, vanishing into the horizon. In a time when enslaved Africans needed hope more than breath itself, this story became a seed of strength. But legends are never born without blood. Behind every whispered tale of flying Africans, there is the hard truth of a people torn from their homeland, brutalized, and forced into the cruel system of American slavery. Igbo Landing is remembered not only because of what happened, but because of what it meant. It was defiance. It was refusal. It was horror and beauty tangled together. Even now, on St. Simon's Island, there is no grand monument, no towering stone to tell visitors what took place. Just the creek, winding silently through the marshes. Just the whispers of the locals. Just the unease in the air, as though every tree still leans toward the water, watching. And so, as this story begins, remember, you are not merely listening to history. You are stepping into a place where the past is not gone, where the ground beneath your feet has been watered with the final steps of those who chose freedom in death, where the air still trembles with voices you cannot quite hear. This is Igbo Landing, a tragedy, a legend, a haunting, and the creek still whispers their names. Before the waters of Georgia ever claimed them, the Igbo were a people of the earth, the forest, and the ancestral spirits. Their homeland lay thousands of miles across the Atlantic, in the rich green heart of what is now southeastern Nigeria. It was a land of rivers and red soil, of yam fields stretching into the distance, of villages tied together by kinship, song, and story. To understand the weight of their final decision, we must begin here, where life was full and rooted. Before the shadow of slavery fell, the Igbo people lived in small, self-governing communities. Each village had elders. Each family had its ancestors. Each life was guided by traditions stretching back through countless generations. They valued independence, hard work, and the strength of their collective spirit. And above all, they believed in freedom. To be Igbo was to be tied to the land, to the rhythm of the seasons, to the balance of body and spirit. But the late 1700s and early 1800s were not kind years. The Atlantic slave trade had carved a wound across West Africa. Raiding, parties, rival factions, and foreign traders had turned the land into a hunting ground. Human beings were captured like animals, sold for guns, cloth, and rum, and forced onto ships bound for lands they had never seen. The Igbo, proud and rooted, were not spared. Imagine a village at dawn. Smoke curling from cooking fires, the laughter of children running between huts, men preparing fields, women carrying water, a life simple yet full. And then chaos. The raiders came fast. Sometimes it was outsiders, strangers speaking in foreign tongues. Sometimes it was neighboring groups, corrupted by the lure of European weapons and wealth. The attack was swift, brutal, merciless. Fires set to huts. People dragged from their homes. Families ripped apart in the space of moments. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who survived were bound in ropes, iron collars, chains. And in this way, men, women, and children of the Igbo were torn from their world. We do not know the names of each who were captured that year of 1803. We cannot hear their voices, except through the silence of history. But we know they carried the weight of their culture with them, songs, prayers, memories of ancestors. Even as they were marched in chains, even as their villages burned behind them, they clung to the one belief that could not be stripped away: freedom or death. Their captors forced them down dirt paths, through forests, and to the coast. The air thickened with salt as they neared the great ports of enslavement: Bonny, Calabar, and others. These ports were gateways to hell, where thousands of captured Africans were held in pens like cattle, waiting for the slave ships. The Igbo, who arrived there, saw sights that could unmake a soul. Long lines of prisoners, shackled together. The stench of blood, sweat, and despair. The cries of mothers torn from children. The eyes of the enslaved, hollowed by fear. And looming beyond. The shore ships. Great wooden beasts, their sails like wings, their hulls dark with shadow. To the Igbo, who had lived by rivers and streams, but had never seen such monsters, these ships seemed otherworldly, unnatural. They were prisons built to float, ready to devour lives. One by one, they were forced aboard. Men crammed below deck. Women and children pressed into narrow spaces, iron biting into their ankles and wrists. The air turned thick with rot, vomit, and waste. Darkness swallowed them, broken only by the faint light filtering through the cracks of the ship's boards. This was the beginning of the Middle Passage, a passage not just across an ocean, but into the jaws of horror, yet even here, bound in. Chains, the Igbo carried something their captors could not steal. They carried memory. They carried songs of their homeland. Some whispered prayers to Chukwu, the supreme creator. Others invoked the spirits of their ancestors, calling for guidance, for strength, for vengeance. And always, beneath every breath, lingered the vow, better to die free than to live as a slave. For many, this vow was not mere words. Some captives hurled themselves into the sea, seeking to drown before they could be broken. Others refused to eat, wasting away in an act of defiance. The Europeans called it madness, but it was not madness. It was the last defense of dignity. The Igbo of 1803, the ones who would one day walk into Dunbar Creek, carried this defiance with them from the moment of capture. They had seen their homes destroyed. They had endured the march in chains. And now, on the belly of a slave ship bound for the Americas, they were preparing not just for survival, but for resistance. The Atlantic was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. Some perished. In the darkness, their bodies tossed into the waves without ceremony. Others survived, scarred and broken, clinging to fragments of hope. The creak of the ship, the lash of the whip, the groans of the dying, these became the rhythm of their existence. But somewhere in the darkness of that voyage, a seed was planted, a seed of rebellion, a seed that would bloom not on the ship, but on the shores of Georgia. It is said that before they left Africa, some of the Igbo whispered a pact among themselves. If the day came when chains were placed upon them, when the weight of slavery pressed too heavily, they would not bow. They would resist together. They would remember who they were, even if it cost them their lives. That vow traveled with them. Across the ocean, carried on the salt air, etched into their very breath. By the time the coast of America appeared, the Igbo were not just survivors of capture. They were not just victims of the Middle Passage. They were people who had been tested by fire and storm, and who carried within them a terrible, unbreakable resolve. And in Georgia, their captors would soon discover that chains could bind flesh, but never the spirit. The ocean is a graveyard. Beneath the rolling waves lie the bones of millions, whose names were never recorded, whose voices were silenced by salt water. They are the lost, swallowed by the Atlantic during the centuries of the slave trade. 2. Speak of the Middle Passage is to speak of a wound so vast that no map can chart it, no history book can contain it. The Igbo of 1803 were thrust into this nightmare the moment they stepped aboard the slave ship. For them, the crossing was not just a journey of distance, but of horror, an unraveling of humanity in the bowels of a floating prison. Imagine the darkness below deck, the ceiling so low that no one could stand upright, the air heavy with damp heat, thick enough to choke. The space measured not in rooms, but in slots, tiny rectangles of wood, where men, women, and children were crammed shoulder to shoulder, chained wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. They were packed so tightly that when one turned, the others had no choice but to follow. Human beings reduced to cargo.day bled into night, and night into day, though below deck the difference scarcely mattered. The only markers of time were the groans of the sick, the crack of the whip above, the scraping of rats in the corners. The stench was unbearable urine, feces, vomit, and the rot of infected wounds. The air itself turned poisonous, suffocating. Those who had no room to breathe, some perished quietly in the night. Others went mad, their screams echoing in the darkness until the sailor came to silence them with a blow. Bodies that no longer drew breath were dragged above deck and hurled into the sea. The splash of a body hitting water became a sound that the living could not forget, a sound that haunted them long after. Yet, in this place of torment, the Igbo still clung to fragments of their identity. When the guards were distracted, whispers passed from mouth to mouth. Prayers murmured in the dark. Old songs hummed so low they were little more than vibrations in the throat. These fragments were lifelines, keeping alive the memory of who they were. For the captains and traders, the ship was a machine of profit. The enslaved were not people but investments, their lives measured only in the silver they would bring at auction. Food was scarce, often just beans or rice crawling with insects. Water, when given, was foul and rationed. Sickness spread quickly. Dysentery, smallpox, fever each day claimed new lives. The Igbo people were no strangers to suffering. They had faced the violence of raids, the trauma of chains, the grief of families torn apart. But now they faced something far more insidious. A system designed to break not just their bodies, but their spirits. Still, the vow remained. Better death than slavery. And so, resistance flickered even in the darkness of the hold. Some captives attempted to strangle themselves with their chains. Others refused to eat, letting hunger consume them. A few, when brought above deck for brief moments of air, hurled themselves into the sea, choosing the embrace of the water over the lash of the whip. The Europeans called this slave suicide. They could not comprehend it. To them, these people were merely property, incapable of such decisions. But they were wrong. The Igbo, and others like them, were not broken cattle. They were human beings enacting the last weapon left to them, the refusal to live enslaved. The ship's crew did everything they could to prevent such acts. They beat those who resisted. They placed iron grills over mouths to force-feed the starving. They shackled bodies even tighter, chaining them to the floor. But still, the spirit of defiance simmered. The ocean around the ship became a silent witness. How many bodies slipped into those waters, carried away by the currents? How many spirits sank beneath the waves, their last breath stolen by salt? The Atlantic turned into a mass grave, stretching endlessly, filled with the unmarked dead. Even today, historians estimate that nearly 2 million Africans perished during the Middle Passage. Their graves are not carved in stone, but etched in the shifting tides. And yet, the Igbo survived. Not all, but enough. Enough to carry their memory across the ocean. Enough to arrive on the shores of America still holding that vow within their hearts. Each day they drew closer to the coast of Georgia, closer to the next chapter of their captivity. But with each day, the anger grew. The determination deepened. The thought hardened like iron. Slavery was not life. When at last the ship neared land, the captives were brought above deck to glimpse their new world. To some, the sight of the coastline was surreal trees rising above the horizon, the air, thick with a new kind of heat, the cries of unfamiliar birds. But the land brought no relief. It was not home. It was not freedom. It was another prison waiting for them. The Igbo stood in chains, looking out across the unfamiliar waters. They did not yet know the names of the places they were bound for Savannah. St. Simon's Island, Dunbar Creek, but already something stirred among them. They had endured the march from their villages. They had endured the darkness of the ship. Now, as the soil of America drew near, they began to prepare for what must come. The traders believed they had succeeded. To them, the Igbo were weakened, starved, and beaten. To them, these were broken people, ready to be sold and bent to labor. But beneath the scars, beneath the exhaustion, the vow remained alive. A vow stronger than the chains, freedom or death. When the moment came, on the waters of Georgia, the vow would be fulfilled in a way the slavers could never have imagined. The Middle Passage was only the beginning. The true act of defiance was yet to come. The year was 1803. The slave ship, its hold emptied of the dead and the living alike, came to rest in the port of Savannah, Georgia. Here, the Atlantic journey ended, but another nightmare began. The Middle Passage was only the first link in the chain. What awaited the Igbo on American soil was a world built on slavery, a machine of labor and profit, a place where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. Savannah was no stranger to the trade. By the early 1800s, it had become one of the busiest slave ports in the southern colonies, its cobblestone streets echoing with the cries of those dragged from the holds of ships. Warehouses lined the riverfront, and along the edges of the city were pens holding places for captured Africans, their backs scarred by whips, their wrists rubbed raw by iron. The Igbo people who staggered off the ship that day were strangers. In a hostile land, their feet touched soil that was not home, soil that would not welcome them. The air was thick with the scent of salt and tar, the cries of gulls circling overhead, the shouts of traders bartering for flesh. Imagine it. A group of men, women, and children herded down the gangplank, chains rattling at their ankles. Their eyes blinked against the harsh Georgia sun. They had survived the darkness of the ship, but the sight that met them now was perhaps worse. Buyers stood waiting, planters with hard faces, overseers with cruel eyes, merchants with ledgers ready to record their purchases. Each Igbo was examined as though they were tools. Bodies prodded, muscles inspected, teeth checked like horses. To the traders, this was business. To the Igbo, it was humiliation beyond words. Their humanity stripped away with every glance, every gesture, every hand reaching to measure their worth. But even in this moment of despair, the vow burned quietly, freedom or death. Among the group, there was a sense, unspoken but powerful, that they must resist. The soil beneath their feet was foreign, but their spirits were not broken. Somewhere in the silence of their chained line, the thought began to take root. They would not remain in bondage. The buyers in Savannah did not know this. To them, the Igbo were simply another shipment of laborers to be scattered across plantations. That day, they were purchased by two men-American slave traders who intended to ferry them south to plantations on St. Simon's Island. It was a routine transaction, one of many that passed through the city's markets. Silver exchanged hands, chains clinked, and the fate of human beings was signed away with a stroke of ink. But the Igbo were not passive cargo. They watched, they listened, and deep within, they planned. From Savannah, the journey to St. Simon's Island was short but significant. The captives were marched toward the smaller boats that would take them through rivers and creeks to their final destination. The roads were hot, the sun pressing down on their bare shoulders, the air thick with the hum of insects. At every step, they felt the chains dig into their flesh. At every step, they felt the eyes of their captors upon them. But they also felt something else, the land itself. Though foreign, the marshes and waterways of Georgia carried a strange familiarity. The Igbo had come from river valleys, from lands where water shaped life. Here, too, the rivers twisted like veins through the earth, carrying both danger and possibility. As they marched, they whispered when they could. Not words spoken aloud, for the guards would strike them, but glances, nods, the unspoken language of a people bound together in suffering. There was a shared understanding. Their story would not end in chains. The captors could not hear this silent pact, but perhaps they sensed something unsettling. Traders often feared the Igbo more than other groups. Across the Atlantic world, the Igbo had a reputation for fierce independence, for resisting slavery at every turn. Plantation owners spoke of their unwillingness to submit, their tendency to rebel, their insistence on choosing death rather than bondage. These whispers spread among the slavers like warnings, yet the hunger for profit blinded them. They ignored the risks, and so the Igbo were loaded into the smaller boats that would take them to St. Simon's Island. The water lapped against the hulls. As the oarsmen pushed forward, the captives crowded together once more, staring silently at the shorelines that passed by. Cypress trees leaned over the water, their roots twisted like skeletal hands. Spanish moss dangled like veils from the branches, swaying gently as though stirred by unseen breath. Even the landscape seemed haunted, as if it knew what was coming. It was here, on these boats, that the vow began to tighten around the Igbo like a net. They had endured the fire of capture, the hell of the ship, the humiliation of the market. But now, as the marshes of St. Simon's drew closer, they saw their final chance. The chains were still on their wrists, but their spirits remained unbound. Captors thought they were ferrying property to a plantation. The Igbo knew they were being ferried toward a choice: death or freedom. By the time the boats reached the shores of Dunbar Creek, the decision was no longer a question. It was a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. The marsh was quiet that day, but in its silence something powerful stirred. The land would bear witness. The water would remember. The air would hold the sound of their voices forever. For the Igbo had not traveled thousands of miles to be broken. They had traveled to carve their defiance into history. And in the coming hours, Dunbar Creek would drink their final act. Savannah had seen their arrival. St. Simon's would see their rebellion. The journey from Savannah to St. Simon's Island was not long, but for the Igbo, every step carried the weight of eternity. They had been purchased, their fates written in the ledgers of slave traders, their bodies considered nothing more than profit. Yet as they were marched toward the smaller boats that would take them across Georgia's waterways, something was building inside them. A tension like a storm gathering on the horizon. The roads out of Savannah cut through swamps, lowlands, places where the ground was soft, where the air buzzed with insects. The captors drove the Igbo forward in chains, their whips snapping whenever the pace slowed. But the Igbo moved not only with exhaustion, but with silence, a silence that was not empty, but heavy, charged, alive. To the guards, it may have seemed like submission. To the Igbo, it was preparation. Along the way, they passed settlements and fields. Enslaved Africans already working the land lifted their heads to see the new arrivals, their eyes meeting in a moment of quiet recognition. They knew what awaited these newcomers: endless days of backbreaking labor in the rice fields, the sting of the overseer's whip, the weight of a life stripped of freedom. Yet in the eyes of the Igbo, there was something different. Not despair, not even fear, but resolve. When at last they reached the shore, the sight that met them was both beautiful and foreboding. The waterways stretched wide, their surfaces shining like mirrors beneath the sun. Spanish moss draped from trees, swaying gently, like gray curtains hung by unseen hands. The marsh grasses rustled in the breeze, and the air smelled of salt and mud, rich and heavy. The boats waited there, tethered to the docks. Small wooden vessels, far less imposing than the massive ship that had carried them across the Atlantic. Yet for the Igbo, These boats would become something more vessels, not of transportation, but of destiny. The captors ordered them aboard, shouting and prodding, the iron chains clinking with every movement. The Igbo stepped carefully, there, feet touching the wooden planks, the water lapping close at their ankles. They were crowded together, their bodies pressed against one another, the oarsmen standing ready to push them across to St. Simon's. The journey was quiet, eerily so. Only sounds were the dip of the oars, the creak of the wood, the occasional cry of a gull overhead. Yet beneath that silence, something thundered in the hearts of the captives. Every stroke of the oars brought them closer to the plantation fields, closer to a life in chains. But every stroke also brought them closer to a choice. The marshes of Georgia held a strange stillness that day. Even the birds seemed subdued, their cries distant, faint. It was as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for something to unfold that would never be forgotten. On those boats, the Igbo exchanged glances, their eyes carrying words their tongues could not speak. They had no common voice they could raise without being struck down, but they did not need one. Their vow was older than this place, older than the ocean they had crossed. It was written in their blood, freedom or death doubt. And now, as the trees of St. Simon's Island drew nearer, they felt the vow rising within them like fire. The captors believed they had succeeded. To them, this was routine. Another shipment of laborers, another profit to be made. They had no reason to suspect rebellion. The Igbo looked weary, battered by the voyage, silent and subdued. To the traders, silence meant obedience. They did not know it meant defiance. The boats glided into Dunbar Creek, the water dark and sluggish beneath the hulls. The marsh grasses leaned close, whispering in the wind. The banks loomed with cypress trees, whose roots twisted into the water, like skeletal fingers. To some, the creek may have seemed peaceful. To the Igbo, it was a threshold. What lay on the other side of this water was slavery. What lay within it was freedom. The captors barked orders, their voices carrying across the still air. But the Igbo were no longer listening. They were waiting for the moment, for the spark, for the act that would change everything. It is said that the Igbo began to murmur softly among themselves, words carried low so as not to be heard. A song, perhaps. A prayer, a chant that rose, like a current beneath the silence. To the ears of the captors, it was meaningless noise. To the Igbo, it was the gathering of strength. Dunbar Creek was calm, but beneath its surface lay the memory of centuries. It had seen storms, floods, and tides. But on that day in 1803, it was about to witness something else, something human, something defiant, something that would mark it forever. The boats pushed closer to the island, the water rippling outward, in slow circles. The Igbo sat in chains, their eyes fixed not on their captors, but on one another, on the land ahead, on the water around them. They knew what awaited them if they stepped onto that shore. Fields, whips, endless days of labor. They also knew the power that awaited them in unity. The vow had carried them from Africa. It had carried them through the darkness of the ship. It had carried them past the humiliation of Savannah. And now, at Dunbar Creek, it was ready to bloom. The captors could not see it, but rebellion was already alive. It was in the silence. It was in the eyes. It was in the slow tightening of resolve, moment by moment, as the boats slid through the water. The march to the boats was more than a journey. It was a procession toward destiny. Every step, every stroke of the oar, every breath brought the Igbo closer to the moment when they would make their choice. And when they reached the shore, the silence would break. The air around Dunbar Creek grew heavy, as though the land itself knew it was about to witness blood, sorrow, and legend. The captors saw only profit. The Igbo saw eternity. The stage was set. The march was complete. The boats had arrived. and the storm was waiting to rise. The days that followed were a blur of dread and routine, each hour carrying the same heavy weight as the one before. The family at the center of the tragedy, once respected, once admired, now seemed to shrink under the shadow of their own home. The house no longer felt like a dwelling. It had become a mausoleum of secrets, where whispers were smothered by silence, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to accuse them of complicity. Neighbors who once visited for warm bread or friendly conversation had stopped coming. Doors that once opened freely to invite them in now remained firmly closed. Eyes glanced but did not linger, and greetings that once carried warmth had grown stiff, short, and distant. The family's isolation was complete, not only because of the townspeople's suspicion, but also because of the silence they had chosen for themselves. In refusing to speak of what had happened, they built a prison of their own making. The father, a man once known for his stern fairness, now rarely spoke at all. He sat most nights in his chair near the fire, staring into the flames with a gaze that was fixed somewhere far beyond the room. His silence was not one of peace, but of burden. The mother, who once brought joy to her children with songs and laughter, now moved like a shadow, her hands always busy, her lips tightly pressed, her eyes avoiding both questions and memories. The children, too, were not spared. They had grown quiet, watching their parents' unease, sensing truths they could not fully understand. They whispered among themselves in dark corners, asking questions their parents refused to answer. Children were not blind, and they felt the shift in the air as sharply as anyone else. The laughter that had once filled the halls was gone, replaced by muffled sobs in the night and footsteps pacing in restless sleep. The town, meanwhile, had not forgotten. Stories spread, as they always do, and each retelling added more color, more horror, more suspicion. Some whispered that the family was cursed. Others insisted that dark practices had taken place behind those shuttered windows. A few even claimed they had seen lights in the house late at night, strange glows, unnatural flickers, as though something was still alive within the walls that should not be. The local church, which once welcomed them into its pews, had quietly shifted away. No public condemnation was ever spoken, but the absence was louder than any sermon. The family began sitting further back until they stopped attending altogether. Their absence confirmed what many had already suspected. Guilt lived among them, but the truth, whatever it was, remained locked behind their lips. That silence, so heavy, did not protect them. It condemned them. The house itself began to bear the marks of their grief. Curtains stayed drawn even during the brightest afternoons. Dust gathered in corners where once there had been cleanliness and order. The garden, once proud with flowers and herbs, grew wild and tangled, as though no one dared touch it anymore. Nature itself seemed to reclaim the land, as though eager to bury what had been planted there. It was not just rumor or suspicion that stalked them. It was something deeper, something unseen. Neighbors swore that when the wind blew across the family's property, it carried a sound unlike any other. A whisper, faint but undeniable, like voices carried through the trees. Dogs avoided the house, howling at its gates but refusing to cross. Children dared each other to run up to the porch, but none ever stayed long enough to knock. The mother, in her most fragile moments, would claim to hear sounds as well. A child's cry in the night, though her own were safe in their beds. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was awake. The faint echo of laughter, sweet and light, that twisted into something mocking before it faded into silence. She never confessed these things to her husband, but her eyes betrayed her fear. He noticed, but said nothing. The father, though less vocal, carried his torment differently. He would rise in the middle of the night and wander the halls, touching door frames and windows, as if checking for something. He often stood for long minutes in front of the cellar door, his face pale, his breathing shallow. But he never opened it. Whatever lay behind it remained undisturbed, sealed in both wood and silence. It was this refusal to confront, this tightening grip on secrecy, that deepened their suffering. Silence had become their weapon, but also their curse. And in a town that thrived on stories, silence was the loudest sound of all. As autumn bled into winter, the family's isolation grew unbearable. Snow began to fall, covering the ground in a white that seemed almost too pure for the darkness it masked. Their house stood stark against the landscape, an island of shadows in a sea of white. Inside, the cold was harsher than it should have been, as though the walls themselves refused to hold warmth. The children whispered of seeing figures in the frost on their windows, faces they didn't recognize, staring in. Once, the youngest swore she saw a handprint pressed against the glass from the outside, though no footprints marked the snow below. Her cries sent the household into panic, but when they checked, nothing remained. The mother scolded her, told her it was imagination. But deep down, she feared it was something else, something their silence had allowed to fester. The father's health began to wane, though no illness was ever named. He grew thinner, his eyes darker, his skin paler. He ate little, spoke less, and when he did, his words carried no weight. The burden of what he carried had seeped into his body, draining him of the strength he once commanded. And still, they said nothing. It was this silence that drew the town tighter against them, and it was this silence that whispered at night within their halls. Silence that echoed in the children's restless dreams. Silence that followed them through every creak of their house. Silence that weighed on their shoulders like an invisible hand pressing down. For in silence, things grow. Rumors, fears, shadows, and perhaps something else, something that feeds on what is left unspoken. By the time winter reached its darkest days, the family had become little more than shells of who they once were. Their voices, when used, cracked with disuse. Their faces, once open, had closed into masks. And in their home, where silence reigned, the truth, whatever it was, remained sealed. But the walls knew, the floors remembered, and the silence that wrapped around them was not empty. It was alive. The silence that had once filled the woods surrounding the Harris estate was no longer a silence of peace, but one of suffocation. By now, the whispers about the family's twisted practices had seeped into neighboring communities. What began as rumors murmured at taverns or during late-night prayers had grown into a collective unease that could not be ignored. Yet, even with the spreading dread, few dared step closer to the source of terror. Fear had a way of shackling people far more effectively than iron chains. Inside the estate itself, that fear was turned into a ritualized order. Every corner of the manor had been reshaped into a theater of cruelty, bedrooms stripped of warmth, kitchens transformed into places of forced labor, and the cellar converted into a dungeon of control. The Harris family thrived on turning human suffering into something sacred, a twisted belief that only through torment could true obedience and purity be achieved. To those trapped inside, escape was a dream crushed before it could take root. The walls of the estate were both physical and psychological. Iron locks and barred windows prevented the body from leaving, while relentless sermons from the patriarch broke down the mind. He spoke in tones that blended scripture with perversion, convincing his victims that suffering was not only expected but necessary. In his warped theology, pain was prayer, tears were confessions, and silence was salvation. The Harris children, raised under this doctrine, became both victims and instruments of their father's madness. Some were forced to participate in acts they barely understood, their innocence reshaped into tools of control. Others bore the scars of rebellion marks across their backs and limbs for daring to resist. Generational cruelty ran like a poisoned river through the family, staining every life it touched. Among those imprisoned, whispers of solidarity began to stir. Young women and children, bound by shared agony, leaned on each other when the patriarch's grip loosened. A stolen glance, a whispered word of comfort, a shared loaf of stolen bread, small gestures of defiance, kept fragments of humanity alive. Yet every flicker of rebellion carried the risk of punishment. Discovery often meant being dragged to the cellar, where the patriarch's voice would rise over the sound of chains, delivering sermons as he enacted his cruelty. The cellar itself was a place where time lost its meaning. Its walls were lined with the marks of those who had been kept there, scratches, names, prayers etched with fingernails or bits of stone. It was here that the darkest rituals unfolded. Survivors spoke of nights when the patriarch gathered his family and captives alike, forcing them to participate in ceremonies that blurred the line between religion and sadism. Chants filled the air, candles flickered against stone, and bodies were broken in the name of divine purification. What made these horrors even more suffocating was their secrecy. The Harris family wore the mask of respectability to the outside world. On Sundays, they attended church, dressed in fine clothes, their children appearing quiet and well-mannered. They donated money to the congregation, shook hands with neighbors, and bowed their heads in public prayer. Behind closed doors, however, their faith had mutated into something monstrous, a private religion built on control, suffering, and silence. The hypocrisy was not lost on those trapped inside. They often heard the family return from town, laughter echoing through the halls before the doors shut and masks fell away. To the captives, it was proof of how deeply the world could be deceived. No one beyond those walls could imagine the depth of torment occurring in the Harris household. And even if they did, who would dare challenge a family that cloaked itself in piety? But cracks were beginning to show. Whispers from survivors who had briefly escaped before being dragged back began to circulate. Some managed to leave faint signs, scraps of cloth hidden in the woods, etched words on nearby stones, broken branches, arranged like symbols. These small cries for help might have gone unnoticed, but together they began to form a pattern, a haunting reminder that beneath the surface of respectability, something unspeakable was festering. For the victims, survival became an act of calculation. They learned when to remain silent and when to speak, when to bow their heads and when to steal a glance toward freedom. Some pretended obedience so convincingly that the patriarch trusted them more than others, allowing them moments of opportunity, moments to gather information, to slip food to the weaker, to whisper plans in the dark. Others bore their rebellion more openly, enduring punishment again and again, but refusing to let their spirits be crushed. Among them was a girl named Ruth, no more than 14, who had been taken under the guise of religious instruction. She became a quiet symbol of resistance. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, spoke louder than words ever could. She etched prayers into the cellar walls, each one a small act of defiance against the family's twisted faith. For others, her presence was a reminder that the human spirit could endure even the most suffocating chains. The Harris patriarch, sensing this undercurrent of rebellion, grew more ruthless. His sermons became longer, his punishments more elaborate. He sought to extinguish every spark of defiance, to remind all within his grasp that resistance was futile. Yet, in his fervor, he revealed something he had long tried to hide, his fear. For in every punishment, every ritual, and every sermon, there was a trembling awareness that control could slip away. This fear extended beyond the estate. The patriarch knew the rumors spreading in town, knew that whispers could turn into questions, and questions into investigations. He worked harder to protect his image, bribing those in power and weaving stories of devotion that made him seem untouchable. But deep down, he understood that no fortress of lies could stand forever. The captives, too, sensed that change was possible. Their hope was fragile, flickering like a candle in the storm, but it was enough to sustain them. They knew that if they could endure a little longer, if they could keep resisting in small ways, then perhaps one day the truth would burst through the walls of the estate. The chains that bound them were real, heavy, and unrelenting. Yet chains, no matter how strong, could be broken. And as the Harris family tightened its grip, the captives held on to a truth that the patriarch could never erase. Even in the darkest dungeons, the human spirit remained unyielding. It was a truth etched into the cellar walls, whispered in the dark, and carried in the eyes of those who refused to be crushed. A truth that one day the world beyond the Harris estate would be forced to confront. The silence that smothered the woods was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence before the storm. The Beckford name once rang with pride across California's gilded hills, whispered in parlors as a symbol of fortune and respectability. But as Sarah Davenport continued her investigation, she came to realize that the family's legacy was less a triumphal tower and more a fragile glass edifice cracking, splintering and dangerously close to shattering under the weight of its buried truths. The more she learned, the more it became clear what happened inside the Beckford mansion in 1857 wasn't merely a tragic story of loss. It was a calculated effort to conceal something darker. Her nights grew restless, haunted not just by the photograph, but by the people behind it. Catherine and William Beckford's somber faces stared back at her from the daguerreotype, the pale outlines of ghostly hands stretching like skeletal guardians around their fragile frames. And though Sarah reminded herself that images could be doctored or flawed, the longer she studied the plate, the more convinced she became that what she was seeing was not an accident. It was deliberate, a message etched in shadows. But if that was the case, who left it there? And why? The Beckford archives provided the first cracks in the family's carefully polished narrative. Dusty journals revealed tensions that had long been sanitized from public memory. Letters from neighbors and distant relatives described the patriarch, Charles Beckford, as a man whose charm masked a cruel and volatile temperament. Behind closed doors, it seemed, the Beckford household was not the stately fortress of refinement. That society had been led to believe it was a cage of fear, ruled by silence. The family's matriarch, Eleanor, had also left traces. Sarah discovered that her name had quietly vanished from many official records after 1857. Obituaries that year gave only passing mention to her, suggesting she had died of illness. Yet the more Sarah read, the less convincing the official story became. There were no burial records, no documented cause of death, no grave to mark Eleanor's passing. It was as though she had been erased, swallowed whole by the shadows that loomed over the Beckford mansion. It was then that Sarah began to suspect. Perhaps the daguerreotype didn't simply capture a family portrait. Perhaps it was evidence of a family secret Eleanor herself could no longer keep. One evening, Sarah spread the daguerreotype and her collection of documents across her desk at the Historical Society. The flickering desk lamp gave the photograph a sinister shimmer, the pale hands glowing faintly as though reaching across time itself. She leaned closer, tracing the outlines, comparing them to sketches she had made of human anatomy. The proportions weren't quite right. The fingers looked elongated, unnatural, more skeletal than flesh. And yet, the shape of the hands bore an uncanny resemblance to Eleanor's. Sarah paused, chills climbing her spine. Could it be that Eleanor's image, distorted or perhaps captured in reflection, had imprinted itself onto the plate in a way unseen until the right light revealed it? Or was it something else, entirely something that had no natural explanation? The museum air felt heavy, as though she were no longer alone in the room. By day, she attempted to reason through it. Daguerreotypes, she reminded herself, were often prone to light leaks exposure flaws, and double imaging. Perhaps what she saw was nothing more than an accident of light. But by night, doubt crept back in. The shadows in the photograph seemed alive, almost shifting, as if they responded to her gaze. The photograph was not content to be observed, demanded to be understood. Sarah's investigation into William and Catherine's lives led her deeper into a story of grief that did not match the polished narratives of the Beckford estate. Catherine, the elder sibling, had been known for her withdrawn nature. A diary fragment Sarah uncovered hinted at her tendency to speak of things no one else could see. William, younger and frailer, had frequent illnesses that neighbors described as attacks of the spirit. Both children, it seemed, lived under conditions that were not simply medical, but perhaps psychological, or even supernatural. The photograph might not have been staged to hide the children's suffering, Sarah realized. It may have been staged to preserve it. A frozen image of a family undone by forces they could not name. One question gnawed at Sarah's mind. If Eleanor Beckford had indeed left no trace, could she have been more than just a victim of her husband's temper? What if she had been the one who orchestrated the photograph, not to commemorate her children, but to send a warning? The idea unsettled Sarah, yet the more she considered it, the more explained. Perhaps Eleanor knew something terrible, something her husband wanted buried. Perhaps her disappearance was not natural at all. And if so, the daguerreotype was not a family heirloom. It was evidence of a crime dressed in shadows. Sarah's obsession with the case began to seep into her daily life. Co-workers at the museum noticed her distracted behavior, her long absences from meetings, her curt responses. But she could not explain. To speak of ghostly hands and vanished graves would only invite ridicule. At night, however, she found herself speaking into the dark, as though addressing Eleanor directly. "What happened to you?" she whispered. "What were you trying to show us?" The silence never answered. But sometimes, when she stared too long at the photograph, she swore the faint outline of the hands shifted closer to the children's faces, as if reminding her that time was running out. Sarah pressed on. She dug into probate records, wills, land deeds, any paper trail the Beckfords left behind. The deeper she went, the more troubling the patterns became. Large sums of money disappeared from the estate around the same time Eleanor vanished. Witnesses claimed Charles Beckford had been seen with unfamiliar men near the docks in San Francisco, men described as rough, foreign, and secretive. The implications were damning. Was the Beckford fortune tied not only to gold, but to something more sinister: trafficking, smuggling, or deals made in the shadows of California's booming port trade? If Eleanor had uncovered her husband's dealings, her sudden absence made far too much sense. And if the children were caught in the middle, perhaps the daguerreotype wasn't meant to frighten, it was meant to tell the truth. Sarah's heart pounded as she pieced it together. The Beckford family photo wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a silent testimony. The ghostly hands weren't random flaws. They were Eleanor's imprint, lingering not as a haunting, but as a final act of defiance, a way to reach across the years and force the truth into the light. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different matters. The historical society had little patience for ghost stories, and no one wanted to tarnish the golden image of one of California's most celebrated families. To challenge the narrative was to risk her career, her credibility, and perhaps even her safety. Yet Sarah could not stop. The cracks in the Beckford legacy were widening, and she was determined to pry them open, no matter what came crawling out. One night, long after the museum had closed, Sarah sat alone in the archives with the daguerreotype propped before her. The silence was oppressive, the kind that pressed against her chest. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. The ghostly hands shimmered faintly. And then, for the first time, she noticed something she had missed. At the very bottom corner of the photograph, barely visible in the shadow, were initials, scratched faintly, almost invisible to the naked eye. E.B. Eleanor Beckford. Her heart thundered. Eleanor had signed the photograph. It was her message, her evidence, her plea. And Sarah knew then, with chilling certainty, that she had just stepped into the center of a story that Eleanor herself had died trying to tell. By the time autumn returned, Sarah Davenport felt as though her life was no longer her own. What had begun as a professional curiosity about the Beckford daguerreotype had spiraled into a waking nightmare. Days bled into nights with little distinction, each filled with fevered research, restless dreams, and the suffocating sense that someone or something had its eyes on her from just beyond the threshold of the visible world. The museum had become nearly unbearable. Every creak of its floorboards, every sigh of air through the century-old vents made her pulse quicken. And always, her gaze drifted back to the display case. The photograph still sat there, framed in polished wood, lit by the soft glow of the exhibit lights. But it was no longer the image she had first seen months ago. The two solemn children, William and Catherine, seemed sharper now, almost more alive than before. Their eyes, once dull with the flatness of early photography, glimmered faintly, as though catching a light source that did not exist. But it wasn't their faces that tormented Sarah most. It was the shadowed edges of the picture, where the faint impressions of adult hands had been captured. She had once told herself they were an artifact of exposure, a trick of the primitive photographic process. Now she knew better. The hands had grown clearer. What once appeared as faint blurs now showed defined knuckles, fingernails the distinct bend of joints. They did not belong to the children, nor to anyone who should have been present. Instead, they seemed to press from the shadows, clutching toward the children, as if desperate to drag them back into darkness. Worse still, Sarah swore she had seen them shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, fingers curling ever so slightly, frozen again when her eyes returned. She tried to share her concerns with her colleague, Mark. He laughed at first, teasing her about staring at the photo too long. But the laughter faltered when she showed him. He leaned in, peered closely, then pulled back, his face pale. Strange, he muttered, though he refused to elaborate further. When she asked him later if he had noticed the hands again, he shook his head too quickly, too defensively. They. Following week, he requested to be transferred to another wing of the museum entirely. He avoided her after that. It was then Sarah realized she was alone in this. She buried herself in the effin' Beckford archives once more. The family's history was littered with tragedy. The fire that consumed their estate, the mysterious deaths of household servants, the disappearance of extended relatives who had visited and never returned. Rumors circulated of a private mausoleum on the property, a chamber where coffins rested not just of the Beckfords, but of others whose names were not recorded. Whispers of rituals lingered in old town records. Accusations that the family had dabbled in practices far removed from Christian faith. Each new discovery tightened the noose around Sarah's sanity. The final straw came late one evening when she stayed long after the museum closed. She sat in the silent gallery, the daguerreotype before her, her notes scattered across the table. She rubbed her temples, trying to piece everything together, when a faint sound broke the silence. A tapping down at first she thought it came from the pipes, but then she realized it was coming from the glass of the display case. She froze. Her eyes slid toward the photograph. The children's expressions remained as somber as always, but the hands, those dreadful hands, were no longer. Faint impressions. They were pressed flat against the inside of the photograph's surface. 5 pale fingers on one side, another 5 on the opposite edge. Both sets straining outward, their palms splayed as though desperate to break free. The tapping grew louder, matching the frantic rhythm of her heart. Sarah stumbled back, her chair clattering to the floor. She clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound continued, inside her skull, inside her very bones. Then, mercifully, it stopped. The gallery fell into silence once more, but the photograph had changed. Now, faint scratches marred the inner surface of the image, as though nails had dragged across it from within. Sarah fled the museum that night, her notes abandoned on the table. She did not return for 3 days. When she finally forced herself back, determined to prove she was not losing her mind, she found the daguerreotype exactly where she had left it. No one else seemed to notice the changes. Visitors walked past it casually, pausing to admire the antique frame, the comment on the children's stiff posture. They did not recoil at the clawing hands. They did not whisper about the scratches. Only Sarah saw them, and the more she saw, the more the hands seemed to reach outward, not just from the photograph, but from the world around her. She caught glimpses of them in mirrors, pale fingers curling along the frame before vanishing when she spun around. She felt them brush her shoulder as she walked alone, their phantom grip cold and clammy. She even dreamt of them, wrapping around her ankles, dragging her into some unseen pit of darkness, where children's laughter echoed endlessly. Sleep deprived, paranoid, and fraying at the edges, Sarah knew she had reached a crossroads. Either she destroyed the photograph or let it consume her entirely. The decision haunted her. She had spent months unraveling the Beckford mystery, piecing together its sinister puzzle. Destroying the image would erase the last surviving link to that truth. But keeping it risked something far greater. Late one stormy night, thunder rattling the museum's windows, Sarah made her choice. She snatched the daguerreotype from its case, ignoring the alarm that blared in protest. Clutching it to her chest, she ran to the museum's furnace room. She shoved the photograph into the roaring flames. For a moment, she felt a surge of triumph. The fire crackled, wood splintering, metal groaning. But as the image began to blacken, a sound erupted that nearly drove her to her knees. Children screaming it filled the room, piercing, heart-wrenching cries that seemed to come from within the furnace itself. She stumbled backward, her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. The daguerreotype writhed in the flames, its surface blistering, but the children's faces did not burn. Their eyes turned toward her instead, glistening with an otherworldly glow. And then came the hands. Dozens of them, pale and desperate, clawed their way out of the fire, reaching through the smoke toward Sarah. She screamed and fled the room, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. When she returned with security hours later, the furnace had gone silent. The daguerreotype was gone. Not reduced to ash, not melted into slag, simply gone. And so were the scratches on the gallery glass. So were the whispers in the hall. But Sarah knew better. The photograph had not been destroyed. It had only moved on. She could feel it, somewhere in the city, biding its time, waiting for the next pair of eyes to fall upon it. The moon hung high, pale and swollen, draping the Davenport estate in its silvery light. By now, Sarah's life had ceased to resemble her own. The past and present tangled together like thorny vines, each memory laced with shadows of the Beckford children. The photograph sat in its frame on her desk, no longer locked away, but displayed like an open wound she could not close. She studied it nightly, unable to look away, as though the image itself demanded attention. Each passing evening, the hands in the daguerreotype seemed to shift slightly altered, slightly closer, their knuckles pushing forward from shadow toward light. Sarah's colleagues at the museum whispered about her decline. Her hair had dulled, her eyes hollowed, her once crisp outfits now creased and careless. But Sarah no longer noticed. She lived by candlelight, surrounded by fragments of history, convinced the Beckford children were not relics of the past, But lingering spirits bound to unfinished business, the nightmares deepened. She no longer saw only William and Catherine in her sleep. Now she saw the figures attached to those ghostly hands, men in black coats, faces blurred but menacing, dragging the children toward shallow graves. In one dream, Sarah herself knelt in the dirt, her hands stained red, as though she had become both witness and participant. The dreams felt less like dreams and more like intrusions, memories, not her own. Driven by desperation, Sarah returned to the Beckford estate grounds, now abandoned and overgrown. The once grand cemetery behind the manor was crumbling, the markers toppled and moss devoured. Yet she felt drawn there, as though invisible strings tugged her forward. Each stone whispered fragments of names and dates, lost to erosion, but she knew William and Catherine's graves must lie within. Her lantern beam caught a half-buried marker, cracked down the center, its inscription nearly erased. Still, she could read enough. Catherine Beckford, 1849 to 1857. Sarah froze. The year of the daguerreotype. Catherine had been dead within months of that haunting photograph. Her breath quickened as she swept her lantern wider, the shadows recoiling. Another marker stood beside it, equally decayed. William Beckford, 1846 to 1857. Brother and sister, buried together, their lives cut short before their teenage years. Sarah collapsed to her knees, fingers trembling as she traced the grooves of the letters. Here lay the children who haunted her waking hours, but something felt wrong. The soil before their markers looked disturbed, uneven, as if the ground had been dug and refilled long after their supposed burial. She touched the earth and felt it looser than it should be after more than a century. Her instincts screamed at her, but her obsession silenced caution. With borrowed tools from the estate's shed, Sarah dug. Each shovelful of dirt was a strike against reason, yet she continued. Hours passed until her lantern guttered the shadows. Lengthening, finally the shovel struck something solid. A coffin, or rather 2 small coffins stacked together, bound crudely with rusted iron nails. Her chest heaved as she pried the lid loose. Inside lay not bones but ashes, bundled in rotting fabric. Someone had burned the children's remains, then buried the charred fragments here. Sarah's throat constricted, horror knotting in her chest. Why? Who had sought to erase even there? Deaths? As she leaned closer, a soft whisper brushed her ear. It was not the wind. Find the truth. She recoiled, lantern clattering against the earth. The sound had been a child's voice, Catherine's, delicate and mournful. Sarah's mind spiraled. The children had not simply died. They had been erased, consumed by secrets powerful enough to twist history itself. Suddenly, she remembered the journal fragments she had discovered weeks earlier, the cryptic entries from the Beckford patriarch, Elijah Beckford. He had written of purification, of children unworthy of inheritance, of sins that must be cleansed. Sarah understood now. The children had been sacrificed, burned to prevent their souls from contaminating the family's legacy. Their father had not buried them with dignity, but had reduced them to ash, ensuring their voices would vanish. Yet they had not vanished. They had waited, and they had chosen Sarah as their vessel. The weight of their tragedy pressed into her bones. As the night deepened, Sarah felt the soil shift beneath her feet, as if the cemetery itself exhaled. Dozens of graves, long forgotten, seemed to stir. The silence broke with faint whispers, overlapping, countless voices rising from the dirt. Men, women, children, victims of the Beckfords, silenced and hidden across decades. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the chorus swelled. Her mind threatened to shatter beneath the collective anguish. The ground trembled faintly, dust sifting upward from the broken markers. The cemetery was not only the resting place of William and Catherine, It was the burial ground of all those consumed by the Beckford family's greed and cruelty. In that moment, Sarah understood why the photograph pulsed with such unnatural energy. It was not just a family portrait. It was a record of a crime, a permanent wound in history that refused to close. The extra hands were not mistakes of exposure. They were the manifestations of countless spirits reaching out from the young. Shadows, demanding remembrance. Her lantern died, plunging her into complete darkness. The whispers circled, some weeping, some chanting, some calling her name. She fumbled for matches, but froze as she felt a small, cold hand slip into her own. She could not see it, but she knew it was Catherine's. A calm spread through her panic, though her body trembled. The child's voice returned, clearer this time. "Do not leave us in silence." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She whispered back into the night, her voice cracking, "I won't." The hand faded, and with it, the voices receded to a low murmur, as if retreating into the soil once more. The cemetery stilled, though the air remained charged, electric with sorrow. Sarah staggered to her feet, lantern dead, shovel discarded, heart racing. She knew what she had to do. She could no longer keep the story confined to museum archives and whispered suspicions. She would document everything: the photograph, the graves, the journal entries, the truth behind the Beckfords. She would drag their sins into the light, even if it cost her sanity, her career, her life. The children had chosen her, and she would not abandon them. As dawn broke, pale and gray, Sarah trudged back from the cemetery, her clothes caked with dirt and ash. She no longer felt like herself, but like a vessel carrying fragments of countless forgotten souls. The photograph awaited her at home, its hands shifting once more, reaching further than ever before. She no longer recoiled. Instead, she whispered to it like a confidant, "I will finish what you began." And for the first time, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of a smile on Catherine's ghostly lips. The storm that had loomed over Ridgewood for weeks finally broke on the night of the town's reckoning. Rain lashed the rooftops with violent force, lightning cracked through the dark sky, and the swollen river carved its path through the valley, as though nature itself was desperate to cleanse the cursed land. Yet, within the hollow silence of the Davenport estate, something far older than the storm-stirred Sarah stood at the heart of the abandoned parlor, her hands trembling as they clutched the brittle photograph. The 1857 image, once the subject of mere curiosity, had now revealed itself as the key to a generational nightmare. Her eyes followed the faint outline of hands that did not belong, skeletal fingers that stretched unnaturally from the shadows, clutching at the children frozen in their eternal pose. She had looked at it 100 times before, but under the flickering candlelight, the faces of William and Catherine Beckford no longer seemed like distant relics. They looked alive, watching, pleading. Behind her, the house groaned with every gust of wind, as though the structure itself were resisting the truths clawing their way to the surface. In the silence between the cracks of thunder, she heard whispers, at first faint, then rising, as though hundreds of unseen voices were gathered in the walls, chanting in a language she did not understand. The floor creaked. She turned, and there they were, the faint silhouettes of the children, not in flesh, but pale as smoke, their forms trembling with the effort of being. William's hollow eyes met hers, sorrow weighing down his gaze, while Catherine clutched a small doll, the same doll that appeared in the daguerreotype, its porcelain face cracked down the center. "You shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. But neither should they. The children did not speak, but their presence guided her, urging her toward the old staircase that spiraled into the basement. The air thickened with each step downward, the dampness clinging to her skin, a smell of rot growing stronger. She reached the bottom, her candle barely illuminating the stone walls, etched with crude marking symbols, carved by trembling hands, repeated endlessly as if repetition held power. At the center of the basement stood the remnants of a crude altar, a table blackened with soot, surrounded by melted candle stubs and long-dried pools of something darker than wax. The weight of countless rituals pressed down upon her, suffocating in its intensity. She set the photograph on the altar, and the moment it touched the surface, the walls shook violently. A scream erupted not from Sarah, but from the photograph itself. The children's faces twisted, their mouths opening wider than humanly possible, releasing a wail that reverberated through her skull. She staggered backward, clutching her ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, tearing into her mind, and then she saw them. Dozens of figures emerged from the shadows of the basement, translucent, broken and bound by invisible chains. Men, women, and children, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies marked by the cruelty of lives stolen. They circled her, their mouths moving in silent despair, their hollow eyes fixed on her as though begging for release. Sarah understood then. The Beckford children were not alone. The entire estate was a prison for souls, bound by rituals performed by those who once claimed to protect Ridgewood. The Beckfords, wealthy and respected, had fed the town's prosperity not through honest means, but through blood. Their sacrifices, hidden beneath piety and power, had tethered Ridgewood to darkness for over a century. She fell to her knees, the truth crushing her. Every missing person whispered about in old records, every tragedy that lingered without explanation, every superstition muttered by Ridgewood's elders, all of it stemmed from here, from this altar, from this family's unholy pact. The storm above raged harder, and the foundations of the house groaned as if they too wished to collapse under the weight of revelation. Sarah reached for the photograph again, but it was no longer just an image. The surface rippled like water, drawing her in. She saw visions the night of the ritual in 1857. The Beckford children stood at the altar, terrified, as robed figures chanted around them. Their father, Charles Beckford, raised a knife, his face illuminated by candlelight, eyes alight with devotion not to God, but to something far darker. Just as the blade descended, the storm had struck, lightning cracking the roof apart, ending the ritual but not destroying the pact. The children's bodies were never recovered, their souls left to wander, bound by the unfinished offering. The vision ended as violently as it began. Sarah dropped the photograph, gasping for air. The children's apparitions now stood before her, their sorrow etched into every detail. Catherine stepped forward, the doll clutched against her chest, and with a trembling hand she placed it on the altar. The room fell silent. Sarah understood. The doll was the key. It had been buried with Catherine, exhumed, and bound to the photograph, becoming the vessel that kept the pact intact. If it was destroyed, perhaps the curse would end. But as her hand moved toward it, the shadows struck back. The chains of the spirits lashed out, coiling around her wrists and ankles, dragging her toward the altar. Her candle extinguished, plunging her into near darkness. The whispers turned to screams, filling the basement with unbearable noise. She cried out, struggling against the pull, her mind racing between terror and resolve. "No more!" she shouted, her voice raw but defiant. No more blood, no more silence. Summoning every ounce of strength, she grabbed the doll and hurled it into the flames of the nearby lantern. The porcelain cracked, the painted eyes blistering as fire consumed it. A scream unlike any she had ever heard filled the basement, the collective cry of countless souls breaking free. The chains shattered, the altar split, and the walls trembled as though the entire house was collapsing into itself. Light burst from the flames, searing through the darkness, engulfing the spirits one by one. But this time, there was no agony. In their cries, there was release. The children's forms began to fade, their faces softening into peace for the first time. William reached out, his hand brushing against Sarah's arm, and though it passed through her, she felt the warmth. Of gratitude? Catherine's eyes met hers one last time, and then silence. The basement was empty. The house, once alive with shadows, was nothing but wood and stone again. The storm outside began to subside, the thunder retreating, the rain softening into a gentle patter. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling from exhaustion. When she finally rose, the photograph lay charred upon the altar, its once clear image reduced to ashes. The curse that had plagued Ridgewood for generations had ended, but at a cost of truth now carved into Sarah's soul. Days later, the townspeople spoke of how the storm had lifted, as though a weight had been removed from Ridgewood. For the first time in decades, the valley felt lighter. Yet Sarah knew better. Some wounds never healed fully. They merely scarred over, a reminder of what once was. She sealed the ruins of the Davenport estate, ensuring no one would ever awaken what had been silenced. But at night, when the wind howled through the valley, she sometimes thought she heard faint laughter, children's laughter, distant yet free. For Sarah Davenport, the mystery of the 1857 photograph was solved, but the shadows of Ridgewood would forever live within her memory. Haunting had ended, but history, as always, would remember.